After his panel discussion on populism and COVID at the Better Discourse Conference in Milwaukee, we caught up with Jack Posobiec. Here's our conversation with him.
So can I ask you something that it wasn't really about the panel, but you got into it a little bit, and you have an area of expertise here that I don't think is exploited well enough in this community, which is your knowledge of China.
Yes.
And one of the things I'm concerned about is I think a lot of people don't understand how intertwined the Chinese and American economies actually are. Like, average people don't understand that. And then when I look at what Trump is doing, for example, with TikTok and WeChat, and then I see the Chinese government's reaction with, you saw the closing of both embassies. They didn't close Wuhan, which would have been a better political move. They upped the game and closed a different embassy, which actually had value. I look at the deterioration of the relationship, and I'm wondering, especially in a post-COVID world where we are trying to retract from the globalism a little bit, what does a disrupted relationship with China look like to the average person in America? Like, what happens from here?
So initially, the difference is going to be felt with sticker shock. There is going to be a price tag associated with this friction. Companies are not going to be able to turn over their supply chains overnight. We're talking trillions of dollars that is being, products manufactured in China, they go in ships, the ships come to America, that's sort of been, and then the money goes back to China, and that's sort of been the paradigm for a very long time. And at the same token, infrastructure isn't just going to magically come back in the United States. Not to quote Barack Obama, but it's not going to happen overnight. We need to start actually rebuilding the physical infrastructure of manufacturing in order to start bringing those back, building those plants, building those factories. However, you're also going to find people then who are looking for alternative solutions to supply chains. But I think there's a great idea now that we can't have all of our eggs in one basket, because what happens if that's an authoritarian regime like China that is in control of so much? And so what they're going to realize is that there are other places in Asia, like India, like Vietnam, where they can start moving and resourcing their supply chains to in order to do that. But this process is going to take time. It's going to be expensive. Those expenses are going to be passed on to the consumer. But you know what? I'm okay with that. I'm okay with paying, what are they always, there's always this argument from the free market fundamentalists that, well, we have cheap Chinese TVs. Look at the price of TVs. They constantly go back to the TV argument. And I say, look, I'm okay with paying a few more dollars for a TV if it means that money is number one, not going to China, and number two, hopefully is going to something that's going to help another American out better. That's money that's going to an American worker to put food on an American table, because that's part of, being a good citizen in your country. It's not just about being able to have some big screen TV. It's actually being a little bit more cognizant of the choices of our economic decisions.
I mean, there's also kind of I think there's been a policy strategy that maybe if we engage with China, they'll stop being authoritarian. I know a lot of regular Chinese don't necessarily like Xi. In fact, a lot of regular Chinese have looked at Xi in the past 10 years. They're afraid to say this, and they certainly won't say it on WeChat or anywhere that's, controlled by the Chinese government. But they think he's going backwards. China was becoming freer, and now there's a lot of Chinese going, well, he's kind of moving us backward. How would you recommend the U.S., and should the U.S. even worry about spreading, we'll say, individualism and freedom around the globe?
Yeah, so Xi Jinping has a couple of issues that are not working in his favor. He's been the first Chinese leader really since Deng Xiaoping to institute his own cult of personality. Prior to his appointment as the chairman of the party, you had this sort of, Hu Jintao was a technocrat. Jiang Zemin was essentially a technocrat. They preferred to sort of be behind the scenes in a sense and stand as a figure of the party, a figure of the country, but they weren't making these huge pronouncements. They weren't aligning the military to their side the way Xi Jinping has. And so because Xi Jinping really instituted this cult of personality, remember, just immediately prior to the pandemic, Xi Jinping had declared himself sort of chairman for life. And he was essentially he priced himself into get the responsibility for everything that's going on now. And so there are people within China who understand that the loss of Chinese face, the face of the People's Republic around the world, that soft power influence that they had been working on for quite some time, certainly in the West, has been because of Xi Jinping and because of his efforts. Now, they're replacing that, of course, with hard power diplomacy. So this is what you're seeing in terms of debt traps that they're setting for third world nations, with the expansion of Huawei in Europe, which is now being stymied, and with their military expansion in the South China Sea, as well as their crackdown on Hong Kong. So essentially what's going on is that Xi Jinping understands that his position now is actually quite precarious. And so his response to that has been to rush to hyper-nationalism and say, we are going to take Hong Kong 25 years early. We are going to rattle the sabers against Taiwan and anyone who would interfere in our, they always call it internal issues, our internal issues. And the same with Xinjiang and everything they're doing with the Uyghurs, the concentration camps, re-education, and essentially just owning it and saying, this is our issue, these are our people, we will do with them as we see fit. And in doing so, he's trying to inflame those hyper-nationalistic tensions. But at the same time, there are also people, as you mentioned, who are yearning for more individual freedom, who liked the path that China was on. And so Xi Jinping has a real, it's the frog in the pot problem. So he's got a problem of the temperature got turned up way too high, and now the frog is jumping out of the pot. And it is potentially unsustainable for Xi Jinping. He does have rivals in the party. He does have rivals in the country. And I've said this a few times, but maybe not so publicly, that the way to deal with China is economically, but then also to go after Xi Jinping directly, call him out directly as being the one who caused this, and then destabilize his position directly with the party. That, coupled with the outside economic influence, is going to push China in a direction of either, as you say, more liberalization, or you're going to see the deterioration of their grip on power.
Sorry, go ahead.
Can I, Jack, can you explain, just for anyone who's not aware, just briefly, who are the Uyghur people and what's happening to them in China? Because as someone on the left, I didn't hear about this until my boyfriend started listening to the War Room podcast with you and Steve Bannon. Wow. And he's a progressive, and he finds the most information about China. So first, could you tell people just a little bit about the Uyghur, what's happening to them in China? And then second, where would you suggest that people who want to learn more about what's going on in China, what other sources should they listen to?
Yeah, so obviously War Room Pandemic is great. One American News, if I've got to fly the flag, of course. And we do actually have Uyghurs on a regular basis. We talk to some of their government in exile, and we've interviewed them multiple times to talk about the situation. So the Uyghur people, and I can tell you a story actually. So when I lived in China, so 2007, 2008, and I'd rented an apartment in Shanghai in the Putuo district, and what was really interesting to me was that as I'd be walking on my way to work every morning, grab the bus, I'd noticed that there was an Islamic mosque right down the street from my apartment one day. I said, well, that's interesting. I didn't expect to see that in China, right?
Especially not like a big city, China.
Right, yeah. Made the biggest city. And then found that there were people around and I realized, these folks don't actually look ethnically Chinese, and then started asking about it to myself. And so as you do more research, you realize that there's this vast Northwest. So Tibet, right? Tibet is, the Tibetan people, and that's Lhasa, the Dalai Lama, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there's an entire province just north of Tibet in the northwest sector of China called Xinjiang. And Xinjiang in Chinese actually means new border, right?
Okay.
So it literally means the new border, because prior to China taking it over, it was known as East Turkestan. And this was part of the ancient Silk Road. So the Silk Road between sort of Europe and Imperial China. These were the people of the Silk Road and the steppes of Asia. So they're ethnically Turkish. They're Turkic people that China later conquered and took over as they were seeking to control the Silk Road. Now, many of those Uyghurs have since come out to some of the major cities of China, like in Shanghai, where I would see them. But the vast majority still live in Xinjiang. Now, because they have a separate ethnic identity, a separate religious identity, and a separate cultural identity to communism, to Han, separate from Han Chinese majority, what China has been doing is going in there, and there were at some points, they've been trying to deny them access to any positions of leadership in the country, deny them access to any positions of power in terms of companies, in terms of the economic liberalization, massive inequality that goes on, keep them in poverty, but even putting Han Chinese and sort of transplanting them, this has been going on for years, into that area to sort of make them the minority in their own homeland. And so that led to actually acts of terrorism in some extreme cases from breakaway groups that were fighting it back against this. Now, I personally don't condone terrorism. I'm explaining the situation, right? Now, Xinjiang is extremely important. And you say, well, why does it matter, right? This is a big mountainous region out in the middle of Asia. Who cares? Why did the Han Chinese care about it so much? Are they just power hungry? No. Xinjiang, where it lies, is strategically crucial to China's plans for One Belt, One Road. Why is this? Because Xinjiang is right on the border between China and Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And China's current plan is to build that One Belt, One Road infrastructure all the way through Pakistan to gain a foothold in a wetwater port at Chennai in the Arabian Sea. And so what they're doing is they want to make sure that they can stabilize for the oil that they need, because China doesn't have the resources. They want Gulf oil, Iranian oil coming up through pipelines, getting that back out to East Asia. They want the economic trade that can then go overland. They're basically rebuilding parts of the Silk Road that they can go directly to Central Asia, to the Middle East, and then eventually through onto Europe. And Xinjiang is crucial to this. So what they're doing in order to break the back of the Uyghur people is they've taken these instances of terrorism and used it as a sort of justification for mass concentration camps, massive re-education programs, teaching them you are not Uyghur, you are Chinese, you must learn the Mandarin language, you must, your religion is false, and you must listen to Chairman Mao, and you must learn the history of the Chinese Communist Party because you are Chinese, you are not anything else. And even to the point, actually, believe it or not, where so China refuses to recognize time zones. And so they require that the entire country, even though China is almost the same geographic size as the United States, to be on the Beijing time. So even in the far northwest of the country, they require, which would essentially be about 3-4 hours behind, they're requiring them to be on Beijing time. So you will actually see Uyghurs wearing 2 watches sometimes. And one of them is set to sort of like the government official time, and then one is set to like local Uyghur time. And so it's become this sort of act of rebelliousness to even tell time.
It's absurd.
On your own. And it seems absurd, right? It seems absurd, but it's an exercise in submission.
Yeah.
It's an exercise in who has power. It's an exercise, if we control your time, and if you submit to our use of time, then, even then you will submit to everything else. And it's very Orwellian. It's very 1984. I've been there. I've traveled to the main city of Urumqi there. And even back in 2010 when I was there on a visit, they had just gone through a round of major protests in the city, and so you saw They shut down the internet for the entire area. They shut down cell phone service to be able to break the protests. And they sent around essentially goon squads of Chinese soldiers, and they sort of call them these internal policemen, and that were just marching throughout the city square in different groups, holding, you'd see about 4 or 5 of them, and then one person would be holding an AK-47, and the rest would be holding just essentially what looks like a baseball bat or a club, just these cudgels that if they saw people protesting, if they saw people doing activism, that they would just go in and break it up using any means necessary.
Wow.
Would you characterize China as communist or just more sort of a authoritarian tax farm? Because it doesn't really appear as, I think a lot of people don't realize that there's different races in China, and they don't realize the kind of forced homogeneity that you're talking about with the Uyghurs. And I think a lot of people also assume that it's kind of old school Soviet communism. And I don't know. I, for one, really kind of view it as more, it's authoritarian, absolutely. But I don't even know if their allegiance doesn't really seem to lie towards that old Soviet style communism. It really seems to just be, we're a class that wants power, and that's kind of the end.
I've used the phrase mafia capitalism at some
that's
times.
good. Yeah.
Because you do have hyper capitalism in some aspects of China's system, but at the same time, that's more from a competitive standpoint. The mafia, which is the party, the CCP, they control everything down to the valuation of their own currency, down to their own liquidity and their central bank. So they can inject as much free money into their system as they want, and this has caused a lot of massive overvaluation and inflation in these Chinese companies. And you're also seeing, because they have a huge, what's going on literally right now in the wake of the pandemic, is the first, and by the way, is fine as long as your economy is expanding at breakneck speed. You can do that. Without any serious ramifications or repercussions. The problem is, what happens if you have an economic slowdown? What happens if you don't have 8% GDP increase quarter after quarter? And now you're seeing, in the wake of the pandemic, 3% returns. You're seeing,
which is
maybe
still
4%,
great, but not for China.
Which is great, but it's not great because of the way that they've been overspending. You have a situation where they call them ghost cities in parts of China, where they're building towers upon towers of these massive high-rises all over the place in every city, not just Shanghai and the tier 1 cities, but tier 2 cities, tier 3 cities, where they build something and then they move on to the next one, and they move on to the next one, and it's essentially it's a jobs program that's funded by nothing. It's funded by debt to themselves, and it's done with funny money. And so that is going to get broken. And here's the issue too, that also the CCP has on their hands, and this is why I go back to talking about the economics, is if you don't have the United States financing this and underwriting so much of what's going on, their own expansion, a 1%, 2% uptick in unemployment in China, in the United States it's bad. In China, you're talking about 100 million people very quickly as the percentages go up. And when the CCP, the mafia, has to deal with the Lao Baixing, this is the old 100 names of China in terms of the hundreds of millions, this gets into what they call the theory of dynastic decline and dynastic cycles in China. Every Chinese dynasty has followed the same cyclical history of rise, growth, power, decay, corruption, falling, and then the new dynasty takes its place, and the cycle reasserts itself. And this goes back thousands of years. And so, through that lens, and by the way, the Chinese Communist Party knows this quite well.
Sure.
And so when they look at this view, one of the ideas, one of the concepts of the ruling dynasty is that they have the mandate of heaven. And so if the mandate of heaven is given to them, that's because they have power, they have popular appeal, they have the ability to govern. But one of the signs that your dynasty has lost the mandate of heaven is economic downturn, natural disasters, and plagues.
Wow.
She's in trouble.
For them to admit, and this is what I've said when I was on War Room and helped launch the War Room pandemic, I was the first guest, is that for them to admit that they have a national plague plays into their understanding of the theory of dynastic decline, and this is why very early on Xi Jinping said this virus is the devil and it is coming from Satan. And so, you think, wait a minute, aren't these the atheists? Why are they talking in terms of, heaven and hell and atheists? Because he understands the mandate of heaven, and he understands the power that this has in terms of popular opinion in China. And so to say this was sent by the devil is a way of casting himself as on the side of the gods, and the virus itself on the side of evil, the side of hell, and trying to say that we're fighting it because we're on the side, not the angels, but to use the Western phrase, we're on the side of the angels, because he understands the situation he's in and the ramifications of what he's saying.
That comports with why. It makes sense with when you look at how they're treating the Chinese people in response to this. I've seen. I get videos and texts from someone who was, like, for example, whisked away into a tiny little concrete room for a month because her mom was on a bus with someone who had COVID after her mom tested positive. But they're like really draconian about stopping the spread of coronavirus. And I guess it makes sense if it's not just a few people die, but it's also some sort of symbolic meaning that, our dynasty's in decline. If this gets out, we really need to lock it down.
You have to show the power of the regime, and it's all about the legitimacy of the regime. The Chinese Communist Party has studied the fall of the Soviet Union obsessively. They're obsessed, and they understand the role that Chernobyl and the fallout of Chernobyl, not just the physical radioactive fallout, but also the political fallout. The fact that Chernobyl happens, and then just a few years later, the Soviet Union falls. They understood that led to a loss of legitimacy for the regime, and that's why the draconian methods for them are necessary, because the regime has to show that they are taking it seriously, that they are so much in control, and that they will do anything to fight back against this virus from hell.
Right. So if the U.S. is going to, like, you've mentioned economics a couple times, and I kind of want to talk about some of this. If the U.S. is going to reach out to Chinese, like, I particularly look at, like, the Guangdong province and, like, Shenzhen in particular, there's a lot of kind of, I'll say, frankly, a spirit of Americanism that permeates kind of regular people. Do you think are you saying that the U.S. should be kind of reaching out to the Chinese people that have an affinity towards the U.S., that have been sending their kids here and kind of want some of that back home as a way to help undermine Xi and the CCP?
Well, no, I think that it becomes very dangerous if it looks like the opposition is U.S.-led. Right, because then that gives Xi the propaganda talking point of saying these are all just foreign actors, or they've fallen under the sway of the American flag. And that's why, even though my heart goes out to the people of Hong Kong, when they started flying American flags, yes, that sent one signal to the United States, but it sent a very different signal to mainland China.
Oh, and it could be used against them.
That could be used against them. So you have to be very careful about the symbology of these situations. And so what I would encourage, though, is the older national identity of China, their long history, their idea that China as a nation, or various forms of nations, has existed for long before the Communist Party. Traditional Chinese ideals, Chinese culture, Chinese beliefs have predated the Communist Party. The Communist Party fought against tradition. Right, yeah. The Communist Party smashed tradition. They destroyed Buddhist temples and statues throughout the Cultural Revolution. They've declared war on history. I mean, you see the parallels in the United States today.
Yes, of course.
And so appealing to that, which is definitely speaks to a baser level in China, and asking, why are we still going along with this dynasty when you've let us, yes, we have certainly better economic situation, but yet at the same time there is so much devastation going on, and you guys are talking about building a road to Pakistan when there's so many people right here in Wuhan dying. Right. Where are the interests of the regime at that point? Why are you so focused on expanding your power rather than helping the people locally? And maybe you shouldn't have turned away from our ancient traditions? Those are the types of questions that the regime does not want you to start asking.
I have a final question for you, because I don't want to keep you too long, but I want to come back to, you mentioned what's happening with the Uyghurs. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening to Christians in China? And then also, how do we get people in the United States to be interested in these issues when it's not covered by our media? And how do we present, and maybe you won't have a great answer for this, but how do we make the compassion case for caring about what's happening to different ethnic communities or different religious communities?
Yeah, sure.
In China?
Well, if you're someone who's interested in racial equality, or if you're someone who's interested in religious liberty, I mean, you're not going to find a more genocidal regime on the planet today than the one in China. What they're doing to the Uyghurs is ethnic cleansing. It's by every definition. What they're doing to the religious community is persecution by every definition. So there's 5 official organized religions through China that are where you're allowed to worship. However, they all have to sort of fall under the sway of Beijing and fall under the sway of the party. So if you don't
5 official approved?
Right.
Okay.
So if you're not in one of the approved structures, what they've done is people have actually formed, they call them house Christians, and so they're worshiping now in prayer circles, in Bible studies, in their own homes, and it'll move. It's sort of a floating secret. It has to be secretly, because if you want to actually study the Bible, if you want to actually have these discussions outside of sort of the approved organized religions in China, it's forbidden. It's completely forbidden. In fact, I'm Catholic. When I went to go to Catholic Mass in China, in some instances, I had to show my passport because I had to prove that I wasn't a Chinese citizen.
In order to worship at the Catholic Church, you had to prove you were not Chinese.
Right.
Wow.
On Easter Sunday.
Wow.
On Easter Sunday. And I couldn't bring my friends with me because they weren't allowed to go in there. Right? This was a foreigner-only service.
I don't think people here, especially a lot of people who are coming from the left like me, maybe haven't traveled a lot and don't really understand what a different place this is.
Yeah, we say that all the time. They've never gone anywhere.
They've never gone anywhere. And so I think that I've actually seen people who are in the social justice left, if you try to talk about what's happening to the Chinese people, whether you're talking about the Uyghurs or Christians, they react uniformly, they recoil from it as some type of xenophobia and racism. And I'm trying to get to this point of being able to better articulate the difference between criticizing the Chinese government and attacking someone's ethnicity, like for being Chinese or
well, you know what I would ask to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is when did you all forget about Tibet?
Yes.
Right, Free Tibet was the bumper sticker
Where's
everywhere.
Free Tibet?
Yes.
When Brad Pitt made 7 Years in Tibet, incredible film. I actually spoke to some of the people that worked on that film, talked about how they smuggled camera equipment into Tibet so they could actually get footage from inside there. A lot of it was filmed outside for obvious reasons.
Right.
But did you guys just forget about all of this stuff? Did you forget about, this? I remember Injustice anywhere.
Is a threat to justice
everywhere. And so why is it that you've sold this out? I remember when George Harrison was, I don't remember, but I've seen the videos, the concert for Bangladesh and everything did, George Harrison, Bob Dylan. This was the left, right?
Yes.
This was the left. And then Tibet became the next one. So we're going to fight for Tibet. And so when you talk about Xinjiang, and this is like, hey, I'm a Catholic, I'm a conservative, and I'm a Trump supporter, and yet, wait a minute, I care about these Muslims in Central Asia? Like, wait, what? You're not supposed to care about Muslims, right? But when you see what's happening there, you have to, as a human being, right, as just someone who has compassion, to say what's going on is wrong. And if we really do believe in, never again in terms of ethnic cleansing, then how can you not speak out against what they're doing? And I get it. I get that it's far away, and I get that it doesn't affect us directly. But couldn't you have said that about so many other atrocities throughout human history? And when you have to dig so deep and twist words around to find things to complain about in the United States versus I can say, hey, 1 million people in concentration camps. That's all I have to say. And the videos that are coming out, quite frankly, I think that the videos that have been smuggled out now of Xinjiang that are starting to get play now in international media and through the power of social media, that's really what it takes to convert people, because you can show it. Because I don't have to show the oppression. I don't have to, you don't have to read a book to understand this oppression. You can see it and you have a visceral reaction. You know what's going on. And this type of cleansing has always led, these types of forces in our world have always come from this specter of sort of these failed 20th century ideologies of fascism, of communism, of totalitarianism, that unfortunately we're still dealing with. Most of the world has walked away from them, but in some places they do still exist. Yeah. And if the world turns a blind eye to what's happening in Xinjiang, that's on the world, and that's something they're going to have to live with. But at the same time, understanding, and this is what I would say to my America First friends as well, who criticize me. They said, Jack, why do you care so much about the Uyghurs? Why do you talk about them all the time? How does that help the people in the Middle America? How does that help the people? I'll tell you exactly how it helps, because why are we doing business with the people that are perpetuating that injustice?
Yes.
Why are we doing business with them? Why don't we look at returning our manufacturing base? Why don't we stop outsourcing in China? Why don't we start returning that? I think it's an incredibly America First position, because those are the ones who reap the benefits of the system of globalization over the past 20 years. And somebody at the Claremont Institute said that when China was brought into the world system, was brought into the WTO, it was almost like if a village has a mafia problem, and then instead of stamping them out, you give them a seat on the town council. Right? Yeah, you've heard this one. You bring them on the town council and say, oh, now that they have a seat at a table, they'll change their behavior. But meanwhile, the mafia is sitting there. Now we're in, boys!
Right. And they violated almost every rule of the WTO and every other international organization they've followed, but then no one seems to care.
Right, nobody seems to, because of this. Yeah. Because there's trillions of dollars at stake in terms of this. There's trillions of dollars at stake over the terms of, just the average Chinese worker and their conditions. There's trillions of dollars at stake over what's been done to the Uyghur people. There's trillions of dollars at stake, and everyone wants to turn to blind eye. Where's the Arab League on this? Where's CARE? Where's Ilhan Omar?
This is
the people that normally would be standing up for this situation. And they want to yell about Donald Trump and everything else. And he had a tweet they didn't like, or he something they think he's stealing their mail. And they were, oh yes, of course. And they'll scream about that, and they'll chant about that, and they'll protest against that. And yet, when there's a regime that's literally committing ethnic cleansing of Muslims, and they're either silent or they'll throw, oh, I condemn, and that's just it, and that's all they ever say.
Whereas
that betrays their actual motive, right?
Yeah, that betrays their actual. But this should be, in my mind, this is something that the right and left could have in common. That this could be a common concern.
Yeah, and unfortunately it's real, right? Yeah. Unfortunately it's real. This isn't some, new theory of woke racial inequality. This isn't some...
It's real oppression.
Treatise. No, it's oppression of real people.
It's not a microaggression.
Of a real
it's
culture.
Genocide.
It's actual genocide.
Yeah. Well, so One American News Network is where people can find you, and you also do, as we mentioned, the War Room Pandemic podcast with Steve Bannon sometimes. Where else can people find you?
Twitter is always, that's sort of my home base. So just at Jack Posobiec, JackPosobiec.
Cool.
Great.
Thank you very
much,
Thanks
for your time, Jack. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Cool.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, we have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy, so go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms, at least for now, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. Our trip to the Better Discourse Conference in Milwaukee was made possible by the support of the following individuals, with a special thanks to Dr. Karlin Borisenko, who generously donated the Super Chat proceeds from her episode with Keri.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to it. For your protection, the following co-conspirators have been unpersoned and marked for cancellation. Please avoid any contact with these individuals. According to the FBI, these are all Russian bots. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Marxism will definitely work this time. Computer voice Curtis. Never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.